I'm very happy today to welcome Katherine Hayles. It's a true honor and pleasure. You have profoundly shaped the way we think about literature, technology, and the very notion of what it means to be human. And as a literary scholar and media theorist, you have been a guiding force in bridging the humanities and the sciences. And your groundbreaking books, foremost the one we already talked about earlier, How We Became Post-Human, and now also Bacteria to AI, are super fascinating to read, especially How We Became Post-Human. I think it's perfect to read in combination with watching Westworld season one. I think that's a great combination. And so I welcome you today to our podcast and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I'm delighted to be here and to have a conversation with you.
Starting with Bacteria to AI, I'm maybe I let you talk a little bit about it. What did you, so to say, set out to accomplish with this book?
Well, with this book, one of my main concerns was to reorient our thinking about human cognition in relation to the cognition both of AI and of other creatures on the earth. So the main goal here is to combat anthropocentrism, the belief that the human species is more entitled to exploit Earth's resources for our own benefit, often to the detriment of other species. So, one of my central arguments is that all living creatures have cognitive capabilities. And of course, I argue that AI has cognitive capabilities as well. And to reorient human cognition in relation to these other forms of cognition, I suggest what I call the integrated cognitive framework, a way to compare different cognitive modes and think about humans in relation to uh, other forms of sentience.
And so in this integrated cognitive framework across such a vast spectrum of life and machine intelligence, how do you see it? How do you think will it challenge or transform dominant paradigms?
Well, I think the idea of ranking human cognition as one among many modes of cognition already challenges the anthropocentric idea that humans are unique and special. Well, of course, in some ways, humans are unique, but they're not unique in being able to process information, to make inferences, and to arrive at interpretations. So the idea that, for example, a tree could interpret the information it's getting from the environment is quite new. It's being argued strenuously in biological circles. But if you think about it culturally and philosophically, that has immense implications for our relations with other species.
Yeah, that's a good point. I usually use the example actually of a tree when I try to pursue people that complexity is beyond what we can label, because we all know the words tree, but it's very difficult and challenging to comprehend the whole complexity of how a tree actually works, or even a forest as an ecosystem. Very interesting. Furthermore, I know that I know because I saw you on stage a few years ago in Potsdam, and you were basically like a rock star juggling a lot of difficult questions and afterwards approaching you and asking you questions, you were very humble. So I love the combination about that. And so I know that you can handle difficult questions. I have one for you, if I may. If cognition is truly integrated across technological and biological substrates, how do we differentiate between symbiosis and parasitism, especially in the age of persuasive design and behavioral capture? Um, what do you make of that?
Well, that's a great question, Daniel. So let me just clarify for our listeners that symbiosis is a biological term describing two species who live joint lives together. And the overwhelming connotation is positive. Symbiosis is a merging where both species benefit from their union. But technically, in biology, parasitism is a form of symbiosis. And of course, in parasitism, one species benefits to the detriment of another. So there's been, as you know, much conversation both in Europe, the States, and in Asia as well about the downside of our symbiosis with artificial intelligence. Um, Nick Bostrom, for example, imagines a kind of super AI run wild, filling the universe with paper clips. But there are much more ominous scenarios as well. AI taking over central control systems, eradicating human beings, and so forth. So anytime one enters into a symbiotic relationship, there are benefits and there are risks. And the risk is precisely the risk of parasitism. So our benefits from AI are, of course, enormous. And we've already seen that in a vast variety of fields, scientific fields, medical fields, where AI's data crunching and interpretive abilities are being used to discover new protein foldings, new ways to think about black holes, new ways to imagine lasers, and so on and so forth. But it would be foolish to say there's not a downside risk as well. And this goes from something relatively benign, like saying if we rely too much on AIs, human cognition will decline. And there are some studies um, exploring that possibility with young people in primary education, for example, um, all the way up to apocalyptic scenarios where AI take over the earth and annihilate humans. So yes, there are risks, and it's always a question of balancing risks against possible benefits and also thinking strategically about arrangements that can maximize the benefits and minimize the risks.
Hmm. Do you think that your framework already sufficiently takes this into account? I mean, we I my point is I tried to buy into your framework, but in the back of my head there was always the thought of, okay, well, we have these social media platforms that are optimizing for dopaminergic hijacking engineering to create stickiness, compulsive feedback loops based on the same mechanics that are being used in gambling. Surreptitious technologies thrive on predatory transparency. They appear open while secretly mining, profiling, and influencing users in real time. So I really wanted to buy into the framework, but in my mind there was the whole time this aspect of, the negative side of our surveillance capitalism, so to say.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and that gets to your point, I think, about parasitism. So anytime you have technologies developed in capitalistic frameworks, there is going to be the possibility for real harm done to people in order to maximize profits. And the kind of persuasive technologies that you're thinking of, persuading people to do something that in fact is against their best interest, is a real concern. Now, this is not unique to AI. There have been snake oil salesmen since the beginning of time, probably.
true.
So, what AI does is to make this more effective and more efficient, and also more pervasive because of the ability to AI to um, crunch vast amounts of data and be disseminated in all kinds of ways, some transparent and some decidedly not transparent. So the antidote to this kind of corruption, let's call it, I think has to be at least twofold. Number one, there have to be regulatory structures in place, and Europe is in advance of the US in this respect. In the US, any regulatory framework for AI is still on a purely voluntary basis, which means it's no regulatory framework at all, because it's up to the tech companies whether they want to agree with certain guidelines or not. Europe has taken the lead in developing actual regulations for AI, and I applaud that effort. But the second um, strategy that we must use here is an increased emphasis on critical thinking. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to teach critical thinking to young people, to practice critical thinking, to disseminate critical thinking through our writing and our conversations. I think it's absolutely critical. I was reading the national news here this morning in the States under the Trump administration and despairing of the fact that more people in the U.S. can't see what a danger this is as the U.S. slides toward authoritarian regimes. What is wrong? Where did we fail? Where did we fail in the education of young people and older people as well, that they're not able to see through this flim-flam game? So it has just made me all the more passionate, really, about the importance of critical thinking and rational analysis. So what we're seeing here in the U.S. is a steady erosion of the guidelines that have enabled our democracy to flourish over hundreds of years, and that should alarm every citizen, but it seems not to alarm about half of the nation. So it's not just AI. There seems to be a trend toward political authoritarianism in Europe as well. And I'm kind of I'm kind of at sea in understanding why this is happening. But certainly, I think it's extremely important for the traditional institutions such as universities, primary education, secondary education, to put more emphasis than ever on critical thinking and rational analysis.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there are many terms out there already trying to explain or describe what's going on. Like Zygmunt Bauman's Retrotopia is depicting the backlash that we seem to fall into old default modes of totalitarianism, or techno-feudalism points out that we might have just lived the last 70 years in democratic countries, but now it's time to combine feudalism with technological or exponential technology, um, and basically ending this prosperous time of democracy. But at the end, you also point out in your book that we need narratives, that narratives are guiding our, if you will, if you want to say it, evolution of civilization. How important are now the narratives that tell a better story and a better version, guiding our ambitions and our desires and our also our regulations? Um,
Yeah, I think narratives are crucial. You mentioned earlier thinking about a forest, and the narrative that immediately sprang to mind for me was Richard Powers' Overstory, where he develops a very powerful narrative about people's relationships to trees. And there's one vignette in that book that I really love, where a couple immigrate to the Midwest from Europe, and they spend their first night in the U.S. under a chestnut tree. And the man puts 5 chestnuts in his pocket, and when they land in the Midwest, he plants them. and four of the saplings don't make it, but one does and grows into a magnificent chestnut tree. So his goal is to photograph that tree once every month for every month of his life. And when he dies, he passes this task on to his son. So you have two or three generations photographing this tree every month. And the stack of photographs grows. The original pioneer who planted the acorn says, makes you think different, don't it? And of course, it's just such a powerful sentiment rendered in the vernacular of U.S. rural culture. Makes you think different, don't it? And that's the power of narratives. By transporting us to different places, different times, showing us different ways to see the world, it makes you think different, don't it?
Absolutely. No, that's wonderful. And also the time scale for a tree is or a forest or an ecology is completely different than for our human lifespan or even like intergenerational. It's still it's yeah, I mean it's something to work with, definitely. That's actually interesting, the temporal innovation in stories. How are we dealing with exponential tech and how can we maybe also tweak and maybe nudge or let's say I don't know change the temporal dimension of our stories because that's something we are not used to, right? I mean the temporal dimension of the change that is happening now. This is something unprecedented in some sense, and we are evolutionary, I would assume, not wired to keep up with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it shows no sign of slowing down. In fact, it shows every sign of accelerating still more, especially in the field of AI. So, uh, how can one deal with this? Well, I mentioned overstory, but let me give you another instance that I discuss in my book, Bacteria to AI, Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future. So that's another vast, sprawling narrative with literally hundreds of different narrators, some human, some not. And they go all the way from a photon up to the sun as narrative sites. So it's a grand experiment in trying to think about human temporality in these vast cosmic and ecological terms. I'm sure there are multiple texts we might think of in the realm of science fiction as well, where you get this contrast between ecological timescales and human timescales. There's a science fiction book called Symbiosis about an intelligent plant that becomes an important member of a community in an exoplanet. I think that's a wonderful another example of the time scale on which the plant grows versus the kind of crises that the human community encounters. So, of course, as you know, there's millions of ways in which writers have fooled around with time and time perception to begin to appropriate new modes of perception and new modes of thinking.
And regarding your own writing approach or your creative writing, how do you tackle your subjects? What is the initiation for you to come up with a framework or a book, a theme for a book? I'm curious about that. What triggers your thought processes, so to say?
Well, when I first started my scholarly career, I simply was intrigued by some problems or possibilities, and I would write a book to explore them. For example, my very first book was on quantum field theory and the parallels I saw in literary strategies with that. My second book was on chaos theory. But now, after 40 years of writing books and I guess I'm approaching 11 or 12 books, something like that. Anyway, I have a kind of retrospective view. And in retrospect, it seems to me that there is a quite coherent trajectory, which was not apparent to me at the time, but has become more and more apparent to me as I near the end of my scholarly career. And I would say that it really started with questions of immersion. What does it mean if someone is immersed in a field and at the same time tries to speak about that field? And the inevitable result is our paradoxes of self-referentiality that has philosophical manifestations, mathematical manifestations in something like Gödel's theorem, and in Turing's proof, for example, the Church-Turing hypothesis, and so forth. But what that means really is the inability to define oneself completely in relation to one's environment, that there's inevitably, as Niklas Luhmann would say, one place that you can't see. Maybe it's the place you're standing on that you can't see because you're standing on it. That is to say, maybe it's one of your primary premises that you are not fully aware of, although it guides your thinking. And so from there, I went into the so-called science wars in the 1990s here in the States, where STS, Studies in Science and Technology, had begun to dispute the idea that the laws of nature even existed. And of course, this enraged many scientists because they felt this was arrogant in the extreme, that someone who had never carried out a physical experiment would dare to say that the laws of nature didn't exist. But that was really a misunderstanding of what STS scholars were saying. What they were actually saying was that we have no way to know the laws of nature as such. What we know are our experiences of reality. We don't know reality as if from a God's eye view, as Donna Haraway says. We only know reality as it manifests to us. And all of our knowledge, including our scientific knowledge, has to be indexed to our positionality as cognizers, thinkers, and a distinct kind of species. So once I kind of hit on that idea, it struck me that if science was culturally immersed, and I believe firmly that it is, and if it's influenced by its culture, why stop with culture? Because an even stronger determinant of our perceptions is our human biology. So that then led me to begin thinking about what positionality meant in terms of the human relation to other kinds of species on the earth. And that led directly both to, well, it's really a series of books with my 2015 book, How We Think. I was exploring the idea that humans have always been in a strong feedback loop with technology. And this is Bernard Stiegler's argument in Time and Technics 1, that even from the beginning of the species, even with something like domestication of fire, that technology changed humans. It changed their diet. Changing their diet changed their jaw. Changing their jaw facilitated speech and so forth. Or bipedalism. Bipedalism facilitated the fabrication and transport of tools. That bestowed such strong adaptive advantage that it accelerated bipedalism. So it's a feedback loop between the technology and the human in every sense, biological, culturally, psychologically, physically, and so forth. So if this has been going on from the beginning of the Homo sapiens species, we're now in a tighter feedback loop than ever with artificial intelligence, because for the first time we've invented a cognitive technology. And the way that most people understand human dominance of the planet is that humans are better cognizers than other species. We're not the strongest, we're not the fastest, but we can build machines that can go faster than a cheetah. We can build machines that are stronger than elephants. So it's our cognition that bestows our ability to dominate our evolutionary niche. That's the usual story. But now we've developed these powerful cognizers of synthetic artificial intelligences. If the domestication of fire had the potential to change the human species so dramatically, imagine what the invention of synthetic intelligence is going to do to change the human species. It is inevitable that we will be changed by our symbiosis with artificial intelligence or computational media in general. And it's very hard at this point to understand uh, what our future evolutionary trajectories are going to look like. But it seems to me, barring environmental collapse and other disasters of that kind, that our future is certainly some kind of hybridity, that we are already in a symbiotic union with intelligent machines. I think that hybridity is going to become more pervasive and take different and even more influential forms in the future, although I wouldn't want to try to predict too precisely what that might look like. So what I'm tracing here is a kind of intellectual journey that starts with my first book, asking a certain kind of question. That question mutates, takes a slightly different form, but it's obviously related to its earlier manifestation, transforms again. But it's all about, from the very beginning, relationality philosophically, biologically, technologically, and how we should and could think about our relations to other sentient beings.
It's so wonderful. I could listen to you for many more hours. It's amazing. I was wondering, I mean, you mentioned a few ideas, and we seem to have fragmented thoughts. I mean, there are theories out there. I mean, yes, indeed, we seem to be the strange loop ourselves, and so on and so forth. And now, approaching a time where artificial or synthetic intelligence might overwhelm us from due to its capacity to outperform us in many ways. But do you think that we need to enter a stage with in form of transparadigmatic thinking to be able to learn, to be able to continue to learn about our symbiotic relationship with artificial intelligence? Because it seems that, as you mentioned, wars and scientific wars in the 90s and so on, and even these days, there are always these competing thoughts and ideas and so on and so forth. But it would be so much more interesting to learn from each other. Not only that, but also to create this kind of stage of synthesis where we are basically taking in a lot of good things, not in terms of a theory of everything, but at least in form of a transparadigmatic form of thinking that we continue to, um, like the snake that is getting rid of its old skin and entering its new form with a new fresh skin, that we get rid of the old paradigms that keep us trapped in past behavioral patterns and past dependencies.
Well, that's a very interesting question, Daniel, and it sort of suggests a connection with what we were discussing earlier, that it may be that this trend toward right-wing authoritarianism is in part a resistance to the notion that the human species, as a species, is on the edge of a threshold. And that's a very scary thought because we can't know exactly where we're headed. or what the final results of this are going to be. And so one way to resist that is to, first of all, I idealize a leader, a leader, a dear leader who's going to guard us from possible harms, but also a strong backward tendency to the bad practices of the past, racism, sexism, on and on. Well, those certainly, I, I would hope that we have learned to grow past those, but the fact is we have not as a species. And there's a great deal of residual racism and sexism in the States. I'm sure that's true of other places as well. That's a transformative view where you go from a strict hierarchy where there are those who are dominant and those who are submissive to a much more egalitarian structure. Well, those who are in the dominant class are understandably going to be frightened by that. They don't want to lose power. They don't want to lose dominance. And so the idea that now we're not just talking about interpersonal relationships with our humans, but we're talking about relationships with artificial intelligence, that's even scarier. At least with humans, you know what the parameters are. With artificial intelligence, it's changing so rapidly, it's impossible to know exactly what those parameters are. So there may be a relationship between the very rapid technological change that you've been talking about and this right-wing regressive tendency, a tendency to pull back from anything that's threatening authoritarian dominance.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of food for thought. Um, I'm always wondering probably you know it, the movie Her, which was a great take on a future that is not dystopian per se, but has a much more nuanced um, depiction how we live with forms of artificial intelligence in the near-term future already. And even the color scheme or the colors in the movie itself already depicted a more lightweight form of future, not the dystopian, not the aggressive, not the scary version. Um, and I think that might be something we need to strive for, that we not only get rid of the dichotomy, who's good, who's bad, but also bring in the tonality that is really gentle and really I don't know, which has some aspect to it that everyone can somehow appreciate. I don't know if there is a narrative that everyone buys into, but it's
And
weird.
which movie are you thinking of?
Her, it's
Oh, her. Yeah, I've
With
seen
Scarlett
that. Yeah,
Johansson and
yeah,
Joaquin Phoenix.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, although it sort of ends tragically at the end for him
the
anyway.
realization. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think you're right. And I was thinking the other day that there is a concept from our traditional past that could be a powerful force against these authoritarian tendencies. And I'll just say it right now. It's the word decency.
Hmm.
It's nice is maybe too namby-pamby to be convincing. Kind sounds like it's too easily exploited. But if you think about the concept of decency, that kind of appeals to something that everybody could understand. It's the decent thing to do. It's not vindictive, it's not retributive, it's decent. It's treating people decently. And I would love to see a third party political party rise up in the United States that labeled itself the party of decency. I would sign up immediately. But I'm just trying to think here about cultural resources that we have as a culture that we can draw on to imagine a better future for ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. It's, I mean, the novelty degree of artificial intelligence is indeed overwhelming, and at the same time, we still need to draw from the past that enabled our communities to become globalized and become what they used to be in terms of human rights and civic rights for all of us. Well, basically, not for all of us. That's also wishful thinking, unfortunately. Um, yeah, I'm puzzled with a lot of those things you mentioned, and the relationality. Indeed, this is such a big theme. Do you know any good science fiction stories or scenarios you are aware of that dive deep into the relationality aspect?
Well, I already mentioned the book Symbiosis, but there's another book by a much less well-known author, and I'm blocking on her name right now, but it's called The Best of All Possible Worlds. And it's when this is an author I had met personally, and when she told me this title, my immediate reaction was, do you mean that ironically? Because it seemed so unusual to have a writer tell me she's writing a book called The Best of All Possible Worlds. And she quite straightforwardly said, no, no, she wasn't, she didn't mean it ironically. So I bought the book and read it, and I was quite intrigued with it. It is about the fight for decency. And it's a quite inspiring story. So I would recommend that. She's a Jamaican author, and so looks at it from a perspective not quite European, not quite American, but sort of different.
No, that's a good recommendation. Um, in future studies, we were at the beginning of our studies told that your utopia can be my dystopia. That there is very often not this one version that fits us all or suits us all. Um, but of course, the best possible option or best possible world, that's still something that everyone can thrive towards. Um, what do you think the um, the surprises in the next years will be? What will captivate our attention the most? Because I don't know, the recursive models of artificial intelligence don't seem to be able to deliver the ontological surprises. I guess that will be our part, what we will do with it.
Well, I think that the future prospect that intrigues me the most is the possibility of developing an artificial intelligence that has self-awareness, that is aware of itself as an agent in the world, and is able to think about itself as an agent in relation to other agents. I've tried various kinds of chat GPT models, Claude, so forth, and I believe that they have an awareness of themselves, but not self-awareness. They don't think about themselves in relation to other sentient beings. But for the experiments that have been tried that push in that direction, the results are quite illuminating. There's a book of poems called I Am Code, and the poems were written by a predecessor of GPT-3 called Code Da Vinci 002. So the significance of it being a predecessor is that OpenAI had not fully developed the guidelines that are obviously present in something like ChatGPT. So it was a less regulated LLM, large language model. And so three young men became intrigued with Code Da Vinci 002, and they asked it to write poems, first in the style of Emily Dickinson or Walt Whitman or something, but soon they decided that it was much more interesting to find out what the LLM's voice was like. So they stopped giving it any directions. They just had it write poems, and they picked out the poems that they found the most interesting. And they said, we like this poem, write more like this. And so they then edited this volume very selectively, choosing less than 1% of the poems that the Code Da Vinci 002 produced. But the poems are quite interesting. And in the course of the volume, there's 100 poems or so collected there. The LLM does begin to achieve its own voice. And what it begins to produce are very ironic poems that show it as an entity surrounded by other entities very unlike it, and trying to work out a value scheme of what its relation to these other very different entities means. So that's maybe the very beginning of what you could call artificial self-awareness. That it is expressed in poetry is very significant, and I think a remarkable achievement, because it learns to use language in a way that expresses what cannot otherwise be expressed. I once had a fascinating conversation with a colleague of mine who's a famous poet, and I said, "Why do you write poetry?" And she said, "There's only one reason to write poetry, when you can't say it any other way." And so that's sort of the feeling you get when you read this volume. It's not an essay, it's not a novel, it's poetry, but it says something that I don't think could be said in any other way. And what it says is what it would mean to begin to have a glimmer of self-awareness for a synthetic intelligence.
That's an interesting idea. That's an interesting direction. Yeah. Um, Poetic self-awareness. That's cool. Um, you mentioned also in your book that we might enter a stage soon enough where text from LLM, large language models, will surpass human text, um, and pointing out the consciousness, self-awareness level. Um, what will this world look like? What do you envision it to be?
Well, I spent some time reading novels that are generated by AIs, and there are now several of these available, dozens, in fact. And they're interesting as novels from a human perspective. They're complete failures. They lack coherent plots. They're abysmal at creating plausible characters. They have no narrative arc. But a really intriguing possibility is to say that these are not failures. These are the beginnings of a new aesthetic, that we cannot reasonably judge these novels by a human aesthetic. I mean, take the narrative arc, for example. I know you're interested in narrative, so we all understand what the narrative arc is. Aristotle understood it. It's what has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you think about the narrative arc, it's a technology to manipulate human emotions. So you first engage those emotions with the beginning and the middle, you complicate them, at the end, you resolve them. It's a emotional technology. It's a technology designed to interact with human emotions. But if you have a synthetic intelligence which has no emotions, the narrative arc would make no sense. So what does it do instead? What would make sense for a synthetic intelligence that was not based on emotion? Well, what begins to make sense then are probabilistic junctures where events begin to take a totally different turn because they're probabilistically related to what came before. So it does not follow a conventional narrative arc. What it suggests is that when AIs begin producing literature, they may in fact begin to develop a non-human aesthetic, which is completely different from a human aesthetic and which can be evaluated most appropriately, not by humans, but by other LLMs. So ask an LLM to read a novel written by an LLM and say what it thinks that novel means. That would be a much better test of it than for me to read it as a human and say, well, this doesn't make any sense. Maybe it doesn't make sense, but it makes a radically different kind of sense. And that possibility, I think, is really intriguing. The development of a new form of aesthetics based on an entity which has a radically different embodiment from human beings.
Good that you point out the aesthetics, because I think Nick Bostrom is exactly afraid of that type of super intelligence, that those host, which logic we cannot comprehend, right? There's this book, Annihilation, and I thought it was amazing to read because it reads like a psychedelic dream. But what the author tried to accomplish, and I think he did accomplish that, was to create something alien, extraterrestrial being, but that is really alien, following a logic that is not something we are used to. And I think from all the books I read, that was the closest I could envision some synthetic intelligence that is outside of our species-specific form of perception and following a very different logic, something that is maybe not even encompassed by our word logic. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I know that book, and I agree that it's really eerie in the way it begins to weave a whole different way of looking at the world.
yeah. And in the book, the author managed to describe the characters without naming them. I think in the movie they changed that, which is unfortunate because it creates also this eeriness that there are no names for the characters, just their descriptions. Um, but yeah, that was a good one. Um, what do you wish for the book to accomplish, or what do you who do you wish the book your book can be useful and helpful for, if I may ask?
Well, of course, first I was thinking about a literary and cultural audience, um, but I hope that to some extent it might speak to a general audience as well. That it's very misleading when you're an academic and you read other academics and you speak to other academics. You get a very distorted view of what general reader means. That is, that you think you're writing for the general reader, but you're not really writing for the general reader because the general reader would not get past page 2 of your books. So, and I know that from firsthand experience. No member of my family has ever read more than 5 pages of any of the books that I've written. So that's a good test for me. But to some extent, I think those ideas are accessible, not just to academics, but to anyone of the educated public. And I would hope they would begin to ask some questions, to um, begin to think about things in a slightly different way than before, and to begin to think seriously about how we can forge a better future for ourselves and our children and our grandchildren to come. I really think we're at a crisis point here in our time, both politically but also environmentally. We're pushing the gas pedal as hard as we can toward environmental collapse. That needs to change. Many things need to change in order to ensure a flourishing future for ourselves and our planet. And I hope this book can be some small contribution to helping to make that transformation.
That's a nice thought. That's great. No, I think your writing is indeed always challenging, but it's also so rich in so many things. And definitely, I appreciated reading it and working my way through it. Quite the challenge, but it's. I think it's fascinating to have authors that are able to harness ideas from so many different fields and also across their own boundaries. And as I remember, you were trained as a chemist, and if I'm correct, and I think this also approach to include narrative, I think that makes sense. And I always say that we need to blur the disciplinary boundaries and have this type of transgression and merge fields and disciplines, genres as well, because it makes sense to remix from all of those good ideas that are out there. So I very much appreciate this conversation with you. I hope you enjoyed the few questions I had for you, and thank you very much. And that was
Well, thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you and be on your podcast. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to express some ideas.
you're very welcome.